Hello, everybody. I'm Flip Pideaux. Welcome to Old Bull TV, your insider's guide to political prediction markets. And today we are examining one specific political uncertainty, but one from which many others may flow. It is the matter of swamp statehood. This week, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a bill that would promote the lowly and famously powerless District of Columbia to be the 51st United State of America, a boon to the star-arranging flag makers of the world and to Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton, but with more debatable impact on the federal legislative process. Here to discuss with us today is attorney and senior writer for National Review Online, Dan McLaughlin. Dan, how are you? Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So Dan, of course, the first question here is this going to happen?
No, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because DC isn't like admitting a normal state, right? A territory that you might want to make a state. You need to amend the Constitution in order to turn the District of Columbia into a state of its own. The district was created by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Its current political status was established by the 23rd Amendment, which was passed in the early 1960s. So in order to turn the specific federal capital district into a state, you need to amend the Constitution. That means you need a whole lot of state legislatures to ratify it.
So what's the House doing by passing this legislation? Does it simply show politics, or does this have legs, in early 2021 under a new president and with possibly a change in the balance of power of the Senate? Or is this simply a no-go so long as you don't have, a supermajority of states willing to ratify it?
Right. I mean, if the Democrats take the Senate and they then take the additional step of abolishing the filibuster in order to speed things across the House, across the Senate floor, even assuming all of that, and I confess I'm not all that up on whether you can filibuster a bill that is specifically to propose a constitutional amendment, but one way or the other, even if they get this through the Senate, a Democratic-controlled Senate, all that does is tee it up for the state legislatures. And so you need, there's no way, given the composition of the states, there's simply no way to pass any sort of constitutional amendment on a party line basis. You need a whole lot of state legislatures that are controlled by Republicans to do it. And as of now, there's no incentive for Republicans to pass an amendment.
And so, of course, it's been, 60 years, almost 60 years, or maybe more than 60 years since we admitted a new state to the nation, being Hawaii. Was it a similar process then, where it would go through both houses of the federal legislature and then be kicked to the states? If you can sort of walk us back through the most recent time this happened, which is, of course, is not in the living memory of most of our viewers.
Yeah, no. Most state admissions do not require a constitutional amendment. They just require the consent of Congress. Now, what happened in 1959 with Alaska and Hawaii, however, was a good amount of political horse trading, which is that it's sort of funny in retrospect because people at the time thought, well, Hawaii will be a safe Republican state and Alaska will be a safe Democratic state, and therefore everybody will get something out of the picture. As it turned out, that was 100% wrong on both counts. Hawaii has been a very, very consistent Democratic state. Alaska has been almost as consistent as a Republican state. But the net result was essentially partisan balance. Now, in admitting new states to the Union, politics has absolutely played a role. In 1888, 1889, 1890, Benjamin Harrison and the Republicans were clinging to a narrow advantage in the presidency and Congress, and they admitted 6 new states, which they thought were going to help Harrison get reelected. As it turned out, 3 of the 6 voted for a third-party candidate, and Harrison lost. But that's where some of the Western states came from. And of course, if you go back before the Civil War, the politics of the admission of new states is very often tied up in, free state, slave state, rather than specifically parties. So sure. Politics has always been a part of the picture, but DC is different because of the fact that it requires a constitutional amendment.
And so because of the way that DC was set up, it can't be simply admitted by congressional, even if Democrats or any bloc wishing to grant a statehood had a majority, they can't simply do it by an act of Congress, whereas they could. And is this correct then for, say, other unincorporated territories of the United States, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Guam, could those be incorporated as states by simple congressional mandate?
Yes, they could. Nobody else is like DC. So if the Democrats got enough votes in the House and the Senate and the presidency, and there was a strong Democratic push for Puerto Rico statehood or Guam statehood, they conceivably could replay what Benjamin Harrison did. But they can't do it with DC. DC is its own creature.
And that's what's been curious to me, at least, and it's hard to dissect the motivations and incentives of lawmakers when a lot of it is, as all such things are, just sort of, theater. But it seems that if DC is sort of the thorniest because it requires a constitutional amendment, which is effectively a non-starter, but you've got 5 other permanently inhabited U.S. territories that would also, at least some of them, presumably be reliable Democratic holds. And especially if you talk about presidential elections, where it's only DC that already has electoral college votes. Puerto Rico, with 4 or 5 times the population of the District of Columbia, does not. And it's harder to game out exactly what the partisan breakdown would be of Puerto Rico because their politics are more divided along the lines of statehood and not, the traditional Democratic Republican lines. But so let's say again, we're sort of a lot of this is. Yeah,
I could just interrupt you to say, as far as Puerto Rico is concerned, the Constitution imposes no restrictions, but Puerto Rico might actually be a little bit different because we have sort of more or less treaties with them, granting them a certain amount of home rule. But yeah, that's exactly the problem with Puerto Rico is that even domestic sentiment within Puerto Rico is sort of divided between statehood and independence.
Right. And so maybe it's a little less reliable. Maybe Democrats, even if they have a bicameral majority, even a supermajority, might not be too sure if that's going to be a lock on 2 new senators in their favor. But let's say they do their research and they decide, yes, if we make Puerto Rico a state, that's going to be 2 new senators in the Democrats' column. If we go to the Northern Mariana Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, these are also going to be Democratic locks. Or say they pick off the 2 or 3 lowest hanging fruit and add 2, 4, 6, 8 senators, bypassing for a moment the legislative lift or the feasibility. Let's say they can do that. Let's say they can stack the Senate with an additional 2, 4, 6, 8, maybe at the outside, even 10 new reliably Democratic senators. And let's say the 2020 election goes for Democrats the way that the polls are suggesting now. They win the White House, they win a Senate majority. If they add 10 more, or several more at least, Senate seats, how significant would that big sort of tidal shift in the Senate balance of power be in terms of when we look out a decade or so and Supreme Court nominations, major landmark legislation, healthcare reform, energy policy? In other words, if the DC statehood prospect is a stalking horse for additional enfranchisement of territories as states, would this represent a major realignment, like a century spanning realignment of the center of gravity of electoral, federal politics?
In theory, it could. In practice, there are a couple of constraints. First of all, the Democrats had that kind of majority in the Senate in the late 50s and well into the 70s. And that didn't stop Republicans from winning the White House. Secondly, I'm not sure that, say, Guam or the Marianas would necessarily be as reliably Democratic, monopartisan as DC. And the other problem, of course, is that if you're assuming that these things are not going to work, there's a certain domestic constituency for DC. Obviously, part of the argument is on racial grounds, frankly. That DC, I think a lot of the people in the country still think that DC is like 70% black. which it was, 30, 40 years ago, but today it's not even majority black anymore. But it has a kind of totemic significance there. Whereas I don't think there's really a domestic American constituency for Guam, for example.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, stacking the Senate would be enormously powerful, and there are unquestionably, progressives of the kind that we encounter a lot if you're into online political debate, who would see this as kind of a neat idea. But I think that you have to have a domestic constituency. You have to be able to go back to your voters, your Democratic voters in Illinois and Maryland, and in a bunch of these states like Wisconsin and Michigan and such, where Democrats have a pretty good foothold, but do not have an overwhelming majority, and explain to them why you did this. And I think there's a theory of why you do this for DC. There's a theory for why you do this for Puerto Rico. There's not a theory for why you make the Mariana Islands a state.
Right.
So,
no, that's fair enough. And if you just look at population, Mariana Islands are 50,000 U.S. citizens. Not that there are any less citizens, but it's a smaller population. Same with American Samoa, about 50,000. Virgin Islands about 100,000. But again, DC is about 700 plus thousand, whereas Puerto Rico is, I think, north of 3 million. So ostensibly the sort of catchphrase around this has been, these are U.S. citizens who are disenfranchised. They don't have voting representation in the U.S. Congress and Senate. But if that's the argument, how does that survive the counter argument of saying, well, okay, if it's intolerable that any permanently inhabited U.S. territory or district, like DC, like Puerto Rico, like the Northern Mariana Islands, even if it's only 50,000 people, if they're being unduly disenfranchised and there is no tolerable solution shy of them having their at least one representative and at least two senators in Congress, what's the limiting criteria that encircles DC, but doesn't go out to at least those 5 permanently inhabited U.S. territories, if not the several more non-permanently U.S. inhabited territories that also include U.S. citizens? In other words, can you find a coherent way to make the argument as kind of the devil's advocate for DC statehood that doesn't say, well, then obviously the next thing we have to do is have 5 or 10 more states after that?
Right. I don't think it's a principled argument. It's kind of, it is kind of a gut level primal argument of the type that many political arguments are, in a way that don't say what they're thinking out loud, which is, this is the continental United States, and these people are not, quote unquote foreigners, right? A lot of Americans still think of the inhabitants of overseas territories as kind of foreigners, which is the way Hawaiians were viewed before 1959, right? Or
Right.
even to some extent Alaskans. So I think that there's the gut level politics that is there, but the principal distinction is not. We have had territories that were not states all the way back to the Treaty of Paris in 1783, when we acquired the Northwest Territories. It's now the American Midwest. So there have always been territories, and DC is in fact in better shape than any of those, because DC residents get to vote for the president, and
Right.
nobody else does. I mean, the other territories get a vote in the primaries, but they don't.
And DC not only gets more of a vote in the presidency than the other territories, they get more of a vote in the presidency per capita than every state save Wyoming, right? Because with only 700,000 people and 3 electoral votes, they have a greater vote share, something like 2.5 to 1 on average per capita in the U.S. in terms of their say of who will become the president. So it's not as though they're fully disenfranchised. One can make an argument that they're not fully enfranchised without a voting voice in the House and Senate, but they're certainly ahead of all the other non-state territories, and at least at the presidential level, ahead of 49 out of 50 states in terms of how much vote share each person's vote actually carries.
Yeah, I mean, it is, that they're certainly not voiceless or powerless. And they have exercised that in a way that marches to their own drum at times. I mean, there have been twice in American history that a presidential candidate lost 49 states. And on both occasions, the losing candidate also carried DC, 1972, 1984, Nixon and Reagan's reelections. and I mean, I think when you look at the arguments against DC statehood, realistically, those arguments fall into two categories, right? One category is about the nature of DC residence, right? The idea that DC it's urban, it's very very geographically concentrated. It's not like other states. It is less populous than 48 of the states. Um, and I think those arguments get ventilated a lot, and they're only modestly persuasive, except to the extent that people want to believe them because they have a partisan argument against statehood, right? And frankly, a lot of the people who care about DC statehood care about it either because they are looking to make the Democrats more powerful or looking to prevent the Democrats from being more powerful. But I think the more persuasive arguments actually against DC statehood have much more to do with the fact that it is unique in America because it is the seat of the federal government. And so giving it, more power in our elections on the one hand, accentuates a power that is already there simply by the cultural fact that I mean, there's like one federal job in DC for every 4 residents, right? That's not true of anywhere else in the country. And
No.
so giving DC more power adds to the overall sense that we already have that we live in a nation that is supposed to be government of the people, by the people, for the people, but is actually government of the government, by the government, for the government.
Sure.
And the other problem that we've seen very dramatic, and the founders were worried about this, Madison worried about it, but we haven't thought about it much until just the last couple of months, is the idea that the federal government can be kind of held hostage by a hostile local government that is, controls the physical security of the streets. And that's a big part of, what Mayor Bowser is pushing for, and some of the other folks in DC are pushing for, is that they didn't like the way Trump used, federal forces to impose order in DC. They want to have their own forms of authority. But, if they can use that in a way that puts pressure on the federal government to act in ways that it might otherwise not, if it was not, physically threatened by the people controlling the security of its physical environment, that's when you start falling into like 19th century France, where 18th and 19th century France, where, the mob in a particular city in Paris was able to exert undue influence over the government of all of France, often to the detriment of, rural France, because the Parisian mob could threaten the crown.
So, Dan, if this is not going to happen, either in a Trump administration or a Biden administration, even with a supermajority in the Senate, why now? Do Democrats simply sense weakness? Is this simply a showpiece of legislation to express support for a voting bloc they'd like to rally behind them and help them win greater majorities in 2020? Why is this happening? Obviously, this is sort of a perennial issue. It's on DC license plates, but this has not really come up for a vote in, I think it's been at least a couple of decades. So why are we seeing this renewed vigor for this push right now?
I think it really is racial politics. It is, and like I said, it's based on a perception that is now outdated, that DC is principally black voters. I mean, I guess it still does have a higher percentage of black voters than Mississippi, which is the state which is the largest number of states. But it plays into a narrative of black disenfranchisement, and because of the the George Floyd case and the street activism that we've seen in response to that, I think there's a certain partisan imperative to pick any other kind of wedge issue that you can get. And so DC statehood becomes part of that agenda.
Okay, Dan, and of course, because our channel and our viewers are focused very much on the political odds and how to play them, it sounds like we have a decent idea of where this is going. But let's say, let's look out 10 years, let's say 2030. How many states are in the union? Your prediction?
I'm going to say 50 because I think there's a tremendous inertia, first of all, at the number of 50 and the number of 100 senators. And that alone, I think, has...
Yeah, it's nice and round.
Has put a lid on it. But
it fits nicely on a flag.
Yeah, and there's definitely pressure. And look, it's possible. I mean, one of the things that we have seen in DC the there's been a lot of population growth recently. There's been a lot of economic growth recently in DC. DC 30 years ago, when people talked about DC, the problem was the city's a financial basket case. It's dirt poor, and it can't balance its budget. And a lot of that is not true anymore because the city is doing very well financially. It has a higher median income than any state in the union. Mainly because of federal largesse. Because the federal government has grown so much, and the money flows now from the rest of the country into DC. So I think if DC is like, a decade from now, if DC is 1.5 million, 2 million people, there's going to be more pressure for this. But I don't, because of the constitutional amendment that would be required, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think Puerto Rico's statehood is going to happen. I think it's more likely at some point that perhaps you'll see a real move to Puerto Rican independence. And I don't think you're going to see a real drive. I don't think there is a political imperative for turning any of the other territories into states, or for, heaven help us, conquering new territory in Canada or Mexico or something of that nature. So I think a decade from now, even 2 decades from now, we probably will still be a nation of 50 states.
Well, in a time of much upheaval, that is reassuring to hear. Dan, we so much appreciate your insights and analysis on this. Can you tell our viewers where to find you and where to find your work?
Sure. I am on Twitter. I'm at baseballcrank.com, and my work can be found on National Review online, and on occasion in National Review, the magazine, as well.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again for joining us. Hope you come back and see us soon. Dan, take care.
All right. You too. Thanks.